O Lord of hosts, be with us, for we have none other help in times of adversity but Thee. O Lord of hosts, have mercy on us.
All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is David Patrick Harry with Church of the Eternal Logos, and today I have the great Jim Jatras with me. How you doing today, sir?
David, I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing good. Again, I want to thank you. I reached out to you regarding talking about some sort of introduction to Orthodox geopolitics, obviously what's going on in Ukraine and Russia. I've watched your interviews with Jay Dyer, and you're kind of the go-to guy in the online orthosphere, and so I would love for you to kind of talk about your wisdom and give people a perspective on really what's going on in the world. Nobody really knows who to trust, and the propaganda is pretty loud. It seems like.
Nobody knows who to trust. Some reason I'm reminded of the I, Claudius series on TV where King Herod tells Claudius, trust no one, trust no one. And to tell the truth, in the world in which we live, in which deceivers are worse and worse, and people are willing to be deceived. Yeah, discernment is necessary, and I don't think there's any simple answer to that question. Oh, you can trust X because Y is a liar. We don't live in that kind of world,
Right.
unfortunately, and maybe we never did. So, as far as my wisdom goes, I'll give you my 2 kopecks for what it's worth. I'm not sure how wise it really is, but I'll do my best.
Well, I appreciate it. I thought maybe where we could start, because one of the things I'm sure you probably witnessed this online is that Orthodoxy's gaining a lot of young male converts right now, especially since 2020. And the goal for our conversation was to sort of introduce how to look at Orthodox countries in relationship to U.S. policies, world history, and such like that. So I thought maybe we could open up with what your background is with geopolitics, and then kind of move into really the Bolshevik Revolution, how that suppressed the church, and then when the USSR collapsed, what's the sort of state of Orthodoxy after that?
Sure. With regard to young men coming into the Orthodox Church, there's a popular conception that autism is a requirement for that. That is not true. That it seems to be quite that you do not have to be on the spectrum to become Orthodox, despite popular belief. Um, I guess the short answer, Dave, is that the last millennium has not been kind to Orthodoxy. I mean, if you look at where the Orthodox countries are in relationship to Western Europe, which of course, uh, you know, uh, fell away from the church in the form of Roman Catholicism 1,000 years ago. You had that Reformation after that, and then the other parade of horribles, the Enlightenment and
Right.
progress and all that sort of thing. You have them on one side, and on the other side, we have Islam. We had the rising powers of Islam that conquered virtually all of the Orthodox world, including finally Constantinople after centuries of holding out. Russia, or rather than Muscovy, did survive as an independent state, but under siege by Roman Catholic powers throughout its history. Plus, having to deal with the Mongols on the other side. So we've always been geopolitically, if we want to put it in those terms, in a very difficult situation. Now, we did have, you might say, a revival of sorts in the 19th century, where the Orthodox countries of the Balkans, Greece, Bulgaria, Serbia, Romania, were able
Mm-hmm.
to secure their independence from the Ottomans.
Right.
And of course, the Russian Empire had become a very powerful state during that time. You also, of course, had other currents blowing into the Orthodox world, like nationalism, for example, the kind of
Right.
nationalism, secular nationalism unleashed by the French Revolution, which also had a corrosive effect on the Orthodox countries newly liberated from the Ottoman yoke, in much the same way that Peter's reforms in Russia had a very dislocated impact on the Russian church and Russian society. And a lot of people would point to this and say, "Well, that how could Orthodoxy be true? I mean, you've had all these problems all along." Well, we know that in life, people as well as the church have always been beset by troubles. I mean, we look at even you might say the good centuries. during the first millennium, you had heresies breaking out in the church. I mean,
Right.
we'd like to think that after the Council of Nicaea, they declared the truth about the divinity of the Son, and it's Miller time. It's all over, and everything's been solved. Of course, that wasn't the case. They were slugging it out with the Arians for the better part of a century, and including having Arian emperors
Right.
that persecuted the church. So it's never been easy, and frankly, I don't think it's supposed to be easy. Not in this world. We will have tribulations in this world, and
Right.
that's true of the church as well as it for individuals, but the gates of hell shall not overcome the church. And I think we believe
Amen.
that. And we also have to look at the positive side, where you started out with young men, and let's be, and young women too. I mean,
Right.
there are fewer of them, but there are young women coming into the church. Well, I wish they would match up a little better and get married and have more little Orthodox kids, but
Right.
that's a whole other topic we can talk about.
Yeah.
But if not if not for these troubles in the 20th century, would Orthodoxy be growing the way it is in the West? Not only from immigration from the
Mm,
Orthodox countries to places like America, but also how many people left because of communism, like seeds scattered across the world that now
right.
are starting to bear fruit. So I think there's reason for both optimism and also concern. Oh, we know that the mystery of iniquity has been working since 2000 years, that these are the last days, and they have been for
Right.
2000 years, and we have to go by God's time scale, or we reach. And so in that sense, I don't think we can expect things in the world ever to be good. We can expect
Right.
them to have their peaks and their troughs, but the general trajectory is going to be downward until it culminates in the end of the world, and we know what that's going to look like. So
Right.
I think at this point we need to take a long view of it, do what we can, work while the sun shines, while it is still day, and the fields are white for the harvest, and the laborers are few. And that's, I
Right.
think, the general perspective we need to take.
Right. I think there's a general perspective too for a lot of the American converts trying to find Orthodoxy as a sort of traditional patriarchy that they can still cling on to in the West. And so there's this narrative again looking at Russia and Ukraine, and it's difficult to sort of piece and parse how to fully understand, is Russia fighting against this global homo agenda? Are they also part of the world? Putin looked like he was a young World Economic Forum leader. That site got that his page got taken down. Um, Most people
Yeah,
are going to be
yeah.
familiar with the Bolshevik Revolution and killing the Tsar and the end of the sort of Russia as an Orthodox country. Now they fall, and it seems like Russia is one of the last vestiges of Orthodoxy, along with, like you said, Serbia, Bulgaria, some of the other Eastern European countries. How should a young person coming into Orthodoxy, and then all of a sudden, the rhetoric, oh, we see in Ukraine, Zelensky's already banning the official Orthodox Church because of sympathies to Russia. How would you talk to a young man on how one should be in the middle and not be pulled in one direction or another, but look at this situation that's going on right now?
Well, again, I wish I had an easier answer for that. Let me just start with a little bit about the perspective I bring to this.
Okay.
I grew up in a military family. My father was a career fighter pilot. He was later the U.S. Air Force attaché in Moscow at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. At that time, I was at the Office of Soviet Union Affairs, the so-called Soviet desk at the State Department. So, I've had a focus on this part of the world for a very long time. And then after that, I worked for many years in the Senate, doing analyses of foreign policy issues and legislation during the time, for example, when the wall came down and the Warsaw Pact fell apart and the Soviet Union fell apart and all these
Mm-hmm.
things happened. And I, having grown up as a very, very strong anti-communist, and obviously my concern for orthodoxy and for truth and justice and normal life and all those things was a big part of that. I was a little bit naive when all of that happened. I kind of thought that, well, thank goodness that's all over, and we can go back to some kind of a normal world, like pre 1914 world, where you don't have ideological crazies running along with red flags and crazy symbols on it and trying to decide. Somebody once said World War II was a war to decide whether the concentration camps of the future would be red or brown. And there was some truth to that the
Yeah,
20th
seems
century
like
was
it.
the century of crazy ideologies. What I didn't realize is that, and I wrote an article about this, in the late 1990s, called Rainbow Fascism at Home and Abroad. How, after having red fascism and brown fascism go into the dustbin of history, unfortunately, there was a new contender, rainbow fascism, that what we've got in the West is essentially another form of the totalitarian ideologies we saw in the 20th century, different species, same genus, as
Right.
communism and fascism and national socialism and so forth. People who thought that they could build heaven on earth through some ideological program. It's a form of Gnosticism, essentially.
Right.
And
Right.
unfortunately, we are trapped in that, because that is the ruling ideology in the Western countries. So
Yeah.
people ask me the question you're asking me: how should Americans, not just Orthodox Americans or even conservative Americans, but Americans generally, patriots of any Western country, and I think a Christian is obligated to be a patriot. It's part
Right.
of loving your honoring your mother and your father, in my opinion. Is that, how do you look at this when you have a government that is motivated by an evil ideology, that is not only trying to impose that ideology on the rest of the world, but is willing to risk destroying the entire world in order to achieve it? And I sort of feel that way. That that's the way people in Russia must have felt for decades.
Mm.
That they had a crazy ideology that was running their country, but it was still their country. So where do you make the division between the ideological program of people who are essentially anti-patriots? And Lenin said, we are anti-patriots. Do we think the wokesters who run our country are patriots in any normal sense of the word? Of course they're not.
No.
But we're patriots. So what do we do? How do we maintain a loyalty to our country, to its history, its institutions, its identity, and at the same time realize our government hates us and hates those very
Right.
values? So,
Right.
and I don't know that there's a simple one size fit all answer to that. What if, God forbid, a war breaks out between NATO, which really means the United States, and
Right.
Russia? I think people patriotically say, well, I have to support my country. I mean, a lot of people during World War II, many people in the Soviet Union defected to the German side because they thought that the Germans could, destroy communism. They probably didn't realize that, what the racial policies of the Germans were going to be toward them. But nonetheless, some people felt that way. Other people felt, well, I don't like the communists, but I've got to defend my country. So what am I supposed to do? And I think Americans will be caught in that very same quandary.
Mm. Great point.
I remember, you may be familiar with Saint Nikolai Kasatkin, the apostle to Japan, and he was in Japan when the Russo-Japanese War broke out.
Mm.
And he was asked by his Japanese flock, who were obviously very distraught, being Orthodox Christians, what do we do now? And he basically told them, look, I'm a Russian, and my duty is to my emperor and to my country, but you are Japanese. Your duty is to your emperor and your country, and you must, with a pure heart, work and pray for a Japanese victory. And I think
Mm.
that's sort of the situation we find ourselves in. I hope it doesn't come to that.
That's a great point.
And
So,
now back to your question too:
yeah.
are we the bearers of this rainbow ideology of this, trying to impose LGBT and pedophilia and every other thing on the rest of the world? You
Outright
bet we are.
pedophilia.
That
Yeah.
is the official ideology of the Western countries,
Right.
and it is. There's simply no way around it.
There isn't at this point in the degeneracy of the Western world. I mean, we just saw, not that it's the biggest example, but the Sam Smith Grammy performance and the absolute degeneracy of a trans man and a homosexual or whatever, however he identifies at this point. But Western culture, there's not a lot as an American to still be proud of. And the idea that even somebody would go and die for their country or go to war for the US in this military industrial complex, it's hard to have the same patriotism that, even again, the naivety of many Americans, say in the 90s and the 80s, we still had a sense of unification and identity in this country that seems to have totally dissipated.
Yeah,
How would
yeah.
you go? Feel free to respond. And then I was going to ask you,
No,
how should we then look at Putin? Because that seems to be a difficult topic for Americans to wrap their mind around in regards to some of the criminality that's been alleged in regards to within the Kremlin and what's going on in Russia. People are suspicious of Patriarch Kirill, and if is he truly righteous in his sentiments in regard to the church and Russia and going on? How maybe speak to a little bit about these topics and how you view them.
Well, there are a couple of things. Let's start with Putin and then talk about the patriarch. As far as
Okay.
Putin goes, a lot of people will say, well, he's not really a sincere Orthodox Christian. He's just pretending. Now, the first thing is I said, well, let's suppose that's true. What does it tell you about a country that it's good politics to pretend to be a good Orthodox Christian? I mean, what does it
Great
tell you about a
point.
country's culture and direction when politicians try to look as pious as possible because that's good politics? I mean, the Marquis de la Rochefoucauld said that hypocrisy is the tribute that vice pays to virtue. There are a lot of bad people out there who pretend to be virtuous because, well, they're hypocrites. But what does it tell you? That people want to see virtue, even if the people who represent it aren't always as genuine as they might be. So even if that's true, that tells you something about the mood in Russia today. Whether he is truly a sincere Orthodox Christian or a good man or a kleptocrat or any of those things, I don't know because I'm not a mind reader. I do think it's notable that he has clipped the wings of the oligarchs that were robbing the Russian state blind and the Russian nation blind. In the same way, by the way, there's the Ukrainian oligarchs were destroying that country, which is one reason we're at this mess right now.
Right.
If it I would say if I had to guess, he is sincere about it. But frankly, I don't think that matters all that much. I'd rather have a bad, immoral, insincere man who does the right thing in a position of power because it's expedient for him than somebody who is a saint on the inside who does all sorts of terrible things because he doesn't know how to do anything effective for good.
Right. Right. So, can you speak then to the geopolitical importance of Ukraine? I mean, those who have studied their history are going to be familiar with why Kiev and that region has been the capital of the Slavic people since Vladimir the Great, and that. But within the 21st century, again, most people aren't going to understand why. What is the relationship between NATO? How did this whole escalate with Russia and the Kremlin, and then continually encroaching upon Russia and Ukraine's supposed to be this neutral place, neutral country. And it seems like the West, we saw the revolution, I believe it was 2014, behind that. Can you speak a little bit to then how we would then understand why the Ukraine is so important, how the West and NATO relate then to Russia in this whole thing unfolding for the last couple of years?
Yes, I will. Let me just add a footnote about Patriarch Kirill
Oh,
on your
sorry, I didn't mean to
previous
cut you
question,
off.
and that is, yeah. And some people, no, not at all. Some people say that, well, it's improper for him to be so closely aligned with Russian state policy. Aside from the fact that, well, in an Orthodox culture, we don't really believe in separation of church and state. They're not the
Right.
same institution, but they should have a close working relationship. There is certainly no separation between the church and society, between church and the nation, and aside from the state. And just as just as we've seen many Orthodox countries sadly go to war against each other, as we did during the Second Balkan War in 1913, you
Right.
expect the churches in those countries to support their country, just like what I said about Saint John Kasakian in in Japan. So
Right.
it's excuse me, I got his first name wrong, Nicholas. Sorry. And so, in any case, yeah, I expect the patriarch to support a country when he's at war. Metropolitan Onofre in Ukraine, the canonical head of the Ukrainian Church, has been very careful to be pro-Ukrainian in this context and to be against the Russian war effort, which is the right position for him to take. He obviously has problem with the current regime, which is trying to destroy his church.
Right.
I don't see any way that they can behave otherwise, either one of them. So
Right.
there's that. Okay, back to Ukraine. Uh, relate back to what I said before when the Cold War ended, and we, instead of going back to a normal world, instead try to impose our own global rainbow ideology on the rest of the world. That's why NATO, instead of saying, hey, we're going out of business, mission accomplished, they instead said, no, we're going to expand. And they wanted to expand for a very simple reason that the people who run our policy, the so called neoconservatives and neoliberals,
Right.
basically think they have a right to rule the world and
Right.
impose their ideology on the world. And that means, first of all, cracking Russia and then eventually cracking China. Then there's smaller characters, get Iraq, Iran, whoever else, but they know that's more of the cleanup mode if you can get rid of the big boys.
Right.
And part of that was to expand NATO, surround Russia with NATO territories, to bomb Serbia, of course. That was sort of the big debut of when the NATO Death Star became fully operational. And then and then of course Ukraine is critical to Russia. Let's remember that Peter the Great declared the Russian Empire after much in the way Bismarck and Wilhelm I guess Wilhelm I declared the German Empire after the Franco-Prussian War. The Russian Empire was declared by Peter when he defeated Charles of Sweden at the Battle of Poltava in 1709, and declared the beginning of the Russian Empire. And Zbigniew Brzezinski, to give him his due, was correct when he says Russia ceases to be an imperial power without Ukraine. Ukraine became an independent state kind of by accident in 1991 when the Soviet Union fell apart, according to the Union republics that were set up by the communists. The territories of Ukraine were cobbled together by the communists during that period. You pointed out that Rus, the ancient Rus state, which, by the way, people mistakenly call Kievan Rus. Nobody ever called that state Kievan Rus at that time. They simply called it Rus, or the land of the Rus. It was a collection of principalities. Kiev was the major one. We also had Novgorod and Suzdal and many other, Chernigov.
Right.
And it was, of course, each of these princes was a member of the Rurik family. So there was a kind of a family operation. But the idea that somehow this was a Ukrainian state as opposed to a Russian state or a Belarusian state is just silly. It's not historical. And as it happened, because of the way the Russian land was carved up by not only the Mongols, but then the Poles, and then the Ottoman Empire, and so forth, Moscow became what they called the gatherer in of the Russian lands. And eventually that included Ukraine as well. We need to remember that before the revolution, 1914, Ukraine was the most nationalist part of the Russian Empire. When I say nationalist, I mean Russian nationalist. And when I mean Russian, I don't mean necessarily the people in eastern Ukraine who are speaking what we call Russian. I mean people all over Ukraine who speak what we call Ukrainian, because this is a very mixed area ethnically. You had Ukrainians / Russians, you had Poles, you had Jews, you had Romanians, you had Germans, you had all sorts of people, Lithuanians, all at each other's throats, as tends to be the case in multi-ethnic societies. So they were very conscious of their Orthodox and Russian identity in a way that, say, somebody in I don't know, near Moscow wouldn't have been, because everybody was Russian. There was no reason to have any particularly high degree of ethnic consciousness. So there's a lot of history here, but the bottom line, for the purpose of your question, is the Western powers understood if they could get Ukraine into the Western camp, into NATO, and maybe someday in the European Union, I don't think so, but certainly into NATO, that makes Russia's security position untenable. I think it was a very big shock for the Western powers that essentially saw Russia as a vassal state in the 1990s under Yeltsin, when Putin, who was chosen by the family, so to speak, to protect the corrupt interests of the Yeltsin clan, turned on them, and it began to stand up for Russia's national interests. And this is something the Western powers did not expect. And what happened, they didn't like it very much. And so that's when they accelerated this. But by the way, you mentioned Yanukovych. I mean, the overthrow in 2014. After my government career, I was an evil Washington lobbyist for several years. And one of the accounts I worked on is I worked for Yanukovych as a lobbyist during the first revolution, the Orange Revolution, in 2004 and 2005. This was somebody, whatever his other faults, who understood that Ukraine, being a very corrupt society, and you can't say he was not part of it, and also that it is a very divided society. There's no single Ukrainian national identity or definition of what Ukrainian is, that the only way Ukraine could survive as a state would be to balance the regional interests, regional identities, and neutrality. And that's the one thing the West could not tolerate, because a neutral Ukraine could not be used as a battering ram against Russia. Hence
Wow.
the 2014 coup,
Right.
and then here we are.
Right. Yeah, and it seems like the West has been infiltrating the church as well. I mean, tied to all this is we're seeing now patriarchs. We're seeing a lot of pro-Vatican rhetoric coming out of various patriarchs of the Orthodox Church, and so as an Orthodox, connecting back to the beginning of the conversation, I have heard non-Orthodox talk about how weak it is in regards to its defense against communism or various aspects of global politics. But I would say that's indicative of the evil one running the planet and why it's constantly, it seems like it's under the microscope or in the crosshairs. Can you speak a little bit now to the situation with the Orthodox Church in Ukraine and how this is unfolding? It seems like Zelensky is making an outright stand against traditional Christianity that isn't already subverted by the Western powers.
That's right. I mentioned earlier Metropolitan Onufri, who is the head of the canonical church in Ukraine. And you'll hear the Western media all the time saying, oh, the Ukrainian church has broken with Moscow. Well, that certainly wasn't the case before the war started. What happened instead, it was a fake church was set up, the so-called Orthodox Church of Ukraine, by essentially Constantinople, Washington, and Kiev, to create an alternative to the canonical church. And there are many currents in this, as Jay and others have pointed out. The FANAR, the Ecumenical Patriarchate, has been an asset of the State Department and the CIA, essentially spent since 1948, when Patriarch Maximos, who was considered to be pro-Russian church, which at the time, let's be fair, was very much under the domination of the Soviets.
Right.
In fact, at the time, the Soviet ambassador had even demanded the traditional role of the Russian ambassador in escorting the patriarch at his enthronement. This was a traditional privilege of the Russian ambassador under the Ottoman Empire. And here he is, the ambassador of the communist Soviet Union, wanting to have the same role. In any case, Maximos was shuffled out. Athenagoras, who had been the Archbishop of the Greek Archdiocese here in America, was flown over on Truman's jet and installed there like a light bulb. And he made it very clear from the beginning, he's doing whatever the United States wants. Now, maybe in the context of the Cold War, that seemed to make a lot of sense, but we basically have the first among equals in our church, or as he would style himself, the first without equal, primus sine paribus, beholden to a government that really doesn't have the best interest of our church or Christianity at heart. Right. So you've got that problem. You've also got the problem that the way Ukrainian identity has been defined over the last few decades since Ukraine became independent is very much influenced by West Ukraine, which is the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, which is the Uniat Church in Ukraine, which, even though it's numerically rather small, only about 10, 12, at max 15% of the population, and has a lot of influence on the government and even on people within the Orthodox Church. That within this strain of Ukrainian nationalism, of Banderism and Shukhevich and all these other people, that there's a strong association with the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. And it's not Greek ethnically, or Greek, it should mean Greek like East and West, like Greek versus Latin.
Right.
And of course, the head of that church is Major Archbishop Sviatoslav Shevchuk, who is very close friend of Pope Francis. They're both from Buenos Aires. And so, there is an agenda within Ukraine, and this gets back to something else you mentioned with regard to ecumenism and this talk that Patriarch Bartholomew and Pope Francis want to engineer something in 2025, the anniversary of the first ecumenical council, maybe arriving at a common dating for Pascha or something of this sort. But some people among the Ukrainian nationalists feel that Ukraine could be sort of a test run for that. If you have a Ukrainian church recognized by Constantinople and then also recognized by Rome, it could be in communion with both, and that would be sort of a test run for intercommunion. So there are a lot of strains in all this.
Yeah. Geez, yeah, it sounds like moving back to a sort of syncretic ecumenical theological perspective within Christianity sounds quite dangerous when so many of us are coming to the Orthodox faith due to its traditionality, its history, and that it's not in communion with the Vatican, that it's not going along with the agenda of Chrislam, that it's not supporting homosexuality, or we see the Church of England now wanting to change the pronouns of God. And so why is the West is Ukraine, just as you said, a sort of tactical agenda for the West to disenfranchise the powers of Russia, or is there rich with resources? Obviously, it's come out now that the U.S. was behind bombing the Nord Stream pipeline. Why are all the interests of the Western powers that be, central banks, Washington, why do they want to get a hold of Ukraine so bad, to the point that they're causing all this internal turmoil even within the church itself, and understanding Christianity as a Orthodox Ukrainian identity?
Well, you've heard the term hybrid war, where it's just not just tanks and artillery and all that. It's economics, it's ideology, it's resources, it's everything. And to be honest, most wars are hybrid wars.
Right.
You've also heard people say we're actually we're in World War III now. This is
Right.
Most of this war is ideological, economic, and so forth. Militarily, about some percentage of it is going on in Ukraine. Hopefully, it stays contained to Ukraine. Hopefully, it's wrapped up fairly quickly, but it could spread, and in fact, it could blow up the whole world. In a way, it's kind of a zero-sum game with only one man left standing, depending on how this thing goes. Because if the Russians lose in Ukraine and Ukraine becomes a NATO puppet state, Russia's security situation is completely untenable. They know it is, and that means eventually Russian Federation will be subordinated to the NATO powers and probably broken up, and they understand that. It's also a life and death situation for NATO now too, not for America, not for ordinary national interests as we might understand them, but for the whole rainbow fascist program of global domination.
Right.
They've got to win here, or else the whole house of cards comes crashing down. And that's why they're willing to fight militarily to the last Ukrainian and economically to the last European. You mentioned the Nord Stream pipeline. So
Yep.
these guys are in it to win it. They don't know how to retreat. They can't just walk away like they did in Afghanistan. And that's why there's always the potential they will do something desperate and stupid. And when I mean them, I don't mean the Russians. I mean our guys.
Right.
And this is something very, and this is why you worry about false flags or pulling some rabbit out of a hat. Let's talk. Okay, we're going to send tanks. We're going to send airplanes now. Really, where are those airplanes going to be based? They think they can fly combat missions out of NATO territory with impunity and have the Russians not hit them? I mean, the level of stupidity, as well as a low spiritual and human and moral qualities we have in our leadership, is beyond belief. And unfortunately, it's not confined to the Democratic Party. A lot of Republicans are like that too. It's basically the Borg. It's like an American version of the nomenclatura.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so where do you look at as the strongest allies for Russia right now? We've seen the West trying to sanction Russia, hit them with all these different economic hurdles. There was talks about Putin and Russia going on to the digital yuan a couple weeks after the war began. Is China emerging? I mean, we saw what happened with Turkey. Some people suspect that may have been there may have been nefarious things behind that. Who knows? But certainly it seemed like Turkey came out with data just a couple days before their tragic earthquake that sort of reoriented the propaganda about the state of the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, and that Ukraine wasn't dominating in the field and taking all these cities as we were told. It was in fact quite the opposite, according to the Turkish sources. So what's Russia's relationship with other nations, and who are their strongest allies right now? Iran, for example, the Persians. Who is it?
Well, you mentioned China, of course. The Chinese and the Russians, of course, have reached a relationship which is not a formal alliance, but as both sides have described it, it is better than an alliance. It is stronger than an alliance. I don't know what can be stronger than an alliance, but that's the way they describe it. Clearly, the Chinese cannot let the Russians lose. Every once in a while, you hear somebody say, "Oh, well, the Chinese are not happy with this." I think the Chinese are thrilled because they don't want to have a war with us. I don't think they're afraid of one, but obviously would be very bad for business. And as you know, the Chinese are very big on business.
Right.
And so I think that if they feel if the Russians are able to prevail in Ukraine and that the Western institutions and Western domination of the world starts to crumble, that is good for China. And of course, the other country we have to keep in mind is India. India had a very good relationship with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. It has maintained a very good relationship with Russia in the post-Cold War period. The U.S. has been trying to rope the Indians into this stupid thing called the Quad against China with Japan and Australia and us. The Indians are going through the motions, but they're not stupid. They realize China's going to be there for a very long time. And they're better off getting along with China, even though obviously they have some issues like border disputes and things like
Right.
that. But in any case, it's clear that most of what they call the global South, including even countries like Brazil that are, essentially in the U.S. sphere of influence, Argentina and others, are not pro-Russian, but they're not anti-Russian. And for the sake of this global confrontation, that's all Moscow really needs. What we need, when I say we, I mean people who run this place. They need these people to get on board, and that's why, for example, we see this pressure on Serbia that's happening right now to come to some final solution on Kosovo, because they're trying to take a country that they know is very pro-Russian and force them to toe the line on an anti-Russian position. I don't know if that's going to succeed or not. I hope not. But in any case, I think what we're seeing is a real squaring off of the world where a minority of the world is going to do what it's told by Washington, even including a country like Berlin that's standing there as we rub their nose in it as we destroy their economy, and they have to say, "Yes, sir, thank you, sir, I'll take another." And it's really pathetic how self abasement. What self abasement you see with Germany and other countries, but they
Right.
follow orders. And then you have other countries that basically say, "Hey, we don't have a dog in this fight. We're going to do business with the Russians. You can't tell us to do that otherwise." That's all the Russians really need, and that's what's
Right.
happening.
How do you see the Muslim world shake out in regard to all this? Obviously, seems like the Saudi powers are in opposition to the Persian powers of Iran. There's internal conflicts within Islam itself. We're seeing a lot of war rhetoric out of the warmongers like Lindsey Graham about Iran. And then we also saw that many of these oil countries stopped using the USD as the currency to measure oil. So can you speak to a little bit, at least from your perspective, how do you see the Muslim world in relationship to all
Yeah.
this?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, there's no single Muslim world. Yeah, I mean,
Right.
the question
Yeah.
of Islam is a very complicated one, and the differences in the governance of different countries, the ones that are a little more secularly leaning. You mentioned the antagonism between Iran and the Saudis. Of course, the Iranians on very good terms with the Russians. The Saudis are becoming in much better terms with the Russians as time goes on. You mentioned selling oil in dollars. I don't think they're going to stop selling oil in dollars, but they're increasingly indicating they're not going to do it exclusively in dollars, which was the deal they reached with the Saudis reached with the United States in the early 1970s. That, of course, means the end of the so-called petrodollar.
Right.
And I don't think a lot of Americans realize this, that when you go to the Walmart or Target or whatever it is, and you buy all this stuff that's very, very cheap, actually, from most of it made from China. It's only that cheap because the dollar has what they call seniorage. It has a kind of a privileged status in the rest of the world, but because of our global empire and because of the denomination of dollars, of oil in dollars, we get to buy stuff from other countries for far less than it's worth. When the global empire goes down, when the greenback is replaced by the redback, which is what some people are calling the yuan already, or maybe there's a gold back currency the Russians and the Iranians are talking about. I guess we call that the gold back. So there are other contenders for the dollar that are coming up. Once those start becoming a big international exchange, we've got a real problem here because other countries are not going to sell us stuff as cheap as they've been doing. I think one of the things we need to keep in mind here is that I gave a speech at the Ron Paul Institute 2 years ago called "It's Later Than You Think." I'm sure Orthodox people will recognize that from Father Seraphim
Yeah.
Rose. And then
Yep.
I did a repeat of that, sort of an update of that this past year called "It's Even Later Than You Thought." I think what's going to happen if the war in Ukraine goes the way I think it's going to go is that the Russians will win in Ukraine. NATO will fall apart in fact, if not in name. But then that wave of dislocation is going to come back and hit the U.S. and hit the U.S. economy, and we're going to go through something similar to what the Soviet Union went through in the 1990s. And it could involve physical breakup of the United States. Maybe it won't. Maybe we'll just go through a terrible period of collapse and crisis here at home. The description of which the specifics are very hard to tell at this point. But it's not going to be pretty, and a lot of people are going to suffer very badly because the bills of all of this phony baloney house of cards, building empires around the world, those
Right.
bills are going to come due.
Right. Yeah, and it seems like they're coming due pretty darn quick. And it seems like the one of the worst situations is Europe itself. So Western Europe, despite its prestige through at least we could say the last 1,000 years or so, it seems like they're the ones that are really going to be hit hard. One, due to population, they're not reproducing at the same rate, which is true for all Western nations. But then massive amounts of immigration of people with fundamentally different cultural values. We're seeing the same thing, mass immigration here in the United States. But how do you see this all? Again, Ukraine Russian conflict. We see the Nord Stream pipeline. I have friends in Greece. I have friends in Italy, friends in Germany. They're all being affected by the energy situation in Europe. The euro's not what it used to be. The central banking. How can you speak a little bit to the place where Europe, at least in your perspective, is looking at the next 5-20 years?
I think we're talking about a much shorter time frame than that. I think we're talking about an existential crisis in Europe where when you talk about words like collapse in an economy, what does that exactly look like? But where we've already seen some attrition in our supply chains here. It's going to get a lot worse, I think, and Europe's going to go through it first and maybe harder. But I think, like I said, it's eventually going to hit back here. I think at some point the the ability of the governmental authorities just to keep running the same scam and telling the same lies and getting away with it, playing musical chairs with the same cast of characters, with the same kind of neoliberal program, the corporate takeover of various governments, that's just not going to wash. Now, when all the gears freeze up like they did in the Soviet Union in the late 1980s and early 1990s, this David, this is beyond my like famous American philosopher Yogi Berra once said, it's hard to make predictions, especially about the future. And all I know is that something bad is going to likely happen, and a lot of people are going to suffer, and there will be, I think, changes of government. But what it looks like, I don't know. I really can't tell you.
Right. How would you describe the situation then for more of the Eastern European countries, including Greece? I've talked with, again, friends in Thessaloniki, and they talk about
Yeah.
Athens and some of the massive immigrations that we don't hear about even within Greece amongst Turkish people, and that they're seeing, in major cities like Athens, a significant number of Muslims with very different cultural values. So even,
Yeah.
we're Orthodox sort of, Greek history, and yet can you speak a little bit to Serbia, to Bulgaria, to Greece, Romania, these types of
Yeah.
places?
Uh, in November, I was in Greece for the first time in half a century. Last time I was there when I just graduated from high school in 1972. And so there's some people I wanted to see there before they die or I do. And I also was in Serbia and in Bosnia. And when I was in Athens, it was very nice generally, but I went to Omonia Square, one of the big squares downtown in Athens. What's that mean? Unity, harmony, something like that. And people would ask, "Why did you go there?" Because when you go there, you don't see any Greek people there. It's all people from Afghanistan, Middle East, God knows where. So now you do find pockets of that in Greece. I don't think it's as bad actually as in some countries like Sweden or Germany. but I don't
Right.
really know. Greece, unfortunately, is in a position where they are on the line with Muslim world, with Turkey, obviously, but the Mediterranean, the Aegean, and a lot of people come through Turkey and then come up into the Greek islands or over the mainland into Greece. So it's a real problem for Greece. The good news for Greece, I suppose, is that most of these people really don't want to go to Greece. They want to go to Germany or someplace with more generous benefits. So it's
Mm.
sort of in Greece's interest to shuttle them out of there as fast as possible, someplace further north. But yeah, this is a real kind of a camp of the saints scenario that is going to unfold over the next few years. I suppose one silver lining of the potential for economic and financial collapse is when these countries become less prosperous, their willingness to just open the doors and let people come in that they have to support is going to plummet as well. And also, I think it's going to, and this is going to sound very ugly to some people, and maybe it is ugly, but at some point, the level of tribalism is going to go up, where people
Mhm.
say, I don't care, get out of here. You don't belong here. This country
Right.
belongs to us. And you do see that, by the way, to some extent in Eastern Europe. It's interesting. And when I say Eastern Europe, I don't mean Greece particularly, I mean the former communist countries.
Right.
It's interesting that communism seemed to be less corrosive of national identity than a lot of the Western ideologies, like consumerism and
Oh,
environmentalism and
yeah.
all that rot.
True.
Even within Germany, people are much more patriotic in East Germany than they are in West Germany. So
Mm.
I think it's going to be interesting, but it's not going to be pretty.
Right. Um, can you speak a little bit to how you kind of see the situation of orthodoxy in America? I know that we're going to kind of wrap up the conversation. Again, I appreciate you coming on and sharing everything with us, but what's kind of your feel on the pulse of orthodoxy in America? I've talked with a handful of priests. They began with Jordan Peterson, seeing many more people begin to enter the church, mostly young men, but we're seeing a lot of young women do it as well, and not young, but all of ages. But obviously, we have a bit of a jurisdiction mess in the United States compared to a traditional Orthodox country. Um,
Yeah.
we see the Greek Church. We have the Archbishop certainly pushing again the LGBTQ stuff, the global homo within the frame of Orthodox Greek Orthodoxy, pro BLM, doing liturgies at pro
Yeah.
LGBTQ churches that are non-Orthodox. We see the OCA, the Orthodox Church of America, also seemingly putting out subversive content and messages regarding BLM and LGBTQ stuff. Can you speak a little bit to the Orthodox, how you see the Orthodox
Yeah.
situation here in America?
Yeah, a couple things. I mean, one thing we should always keep in mind is that the currents outside of the church always manifest themselves in the church, and this has always been true. Whether it's a
Mm-hmm.
pagan society or an Islamic society, you're going to get or the troubles within the church by various heresies and so forth. So the idea that the troubles like the LGBT and feminism and
Yep.
Black Lives Matter and all this nonsense that have wrought havoc in the Western confessions have basically destroyed the Protestant denominations and are pretty
Right.
much finishing off the Roman Catholic Church, they're going to attack us as well. They will not overcome us, but let's be honest, we will lose people. We will
Right.
lose some part of our church who've gone off with the crowd, and that's to be expected.
Right.
It's the parable of the sower, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it should not really surprise us. But then at the same time, you have other people coming into the church, and part of this is an ethnic transition. Obviously, Orthodoxy began in this country as an ethnic church. First,
Right.
the Russians preaching on the Indians in Alaska, but then also all the various immigrants, Greeks and Syrians and Serbs and others that came here. I think we're going on the ethics front. We're going through something kind of like what the church did in the first century when it started as an all Hebrew church ethnically, but over time, as more and more non-Hebrews came into the church, became essentially a Gentile church with very
Right.
few people of Jewish origin in it. I think I'm of Greek origin. I was born here. My parents were born here. All four of my grandparents were from Sparta. So I've been American for 100 years. I'd like to say, and but I think that's sort of a microcosm of what we see happening in the church, where a church that was an immigrant church in say 1920 by 2120 may have very few people who are quote ethnic Orthodox in it. compared to the total. And this is probably a natural thing, and there will be growing pains. As far as the jurisdictionalism goes, um, a lot of people say we have to have a united American church, and in principle, I think that would be a great idea. It just I don't see any path to get there that
Right.
doesn't look like a disaster, especially if it's under Constantinople, which I certainly would not want to see. You
Right.
talked about Archbishop Elpi the Foros, or the help bearer, excuse me, the hope bearer, or some of the Greeks call him Elpidoktonos, the hope slayer. And it's
I never heard that
this
one.
is this part of what we're what we're contending with here. And but I think this too will pass. I think what you pointed to is the really hopeful sign, and that is as American society becomes more and more godless, and as the Western confessions go down their merry path to destruction, which they're doing, people are looking around, and you find many people come to Orthodoxy. They didn't even know what they were looking for when they started looking. They didn't know we existed.
Right.
But eventually they do find it, and this is providential. And yeah, when they come here, it's not all a bed of roses. It's, I like to say, it's the right church with all the wrong people in it, and we've got our problems too. But it is the ark of salvation, and I think people come to realize that as the world around them, turns into total clown world. Where do
Right.
you go? And
Right.
I think we can offer that with all of our faults.
Did you see the leaked FBI memo about what they called radical traditional Catholics, and that they needed to monitor this domestic population for their resistance, I guess, to again specifically mentioned was the LGBTQ and pro-abortion rights. Did you see that? What were your general thoughts, and how do you kind of see really traditional Christians? I think is going to become more apparent. The Orthodox Church is going to be legitimately persecuted by the federal government for people just upholding biblical values.
Yeah, it's I don't know if you've seen this novel Icon. It's more of a kid's book. It's about basically martyrdom in a future America. And I don't think that's too far fetched at some point in the distant future. As far as these radical Catholics, I guess I feel a little envy there. I mean, when do we get our FBI memo, but it's maybe if our bishops were a little more forthright in saying what is what, we'd get some of that sweet love too. But I think what it comes down to is, given the kind of a regime we have now, is that there's a kind of a hostility to the core American identity. People who are of European origin, Christian religion, speak the English language, identify with the America that we all grew up. Well, maybe you didn't; you're too young. But the America we old people grew up in, that was proud of our history, proud of who we were, and didn't think we had to spend our whole lives apologizing for stuff. Well, those are the kind of Americans that are going to be targeted, and obviously any strong Christian identity is going to be front and center on that. And
Right.
I think, in a way, that's a sign of God's favor.
Right. And I find it so interesting too. Obviously, the rhetoric of toxic masculinity, and really we see the outright rejection of traditional masculine roles in our Western societies. But I hardly ever
Yeah.
hear criticisms geared towards Islam, and so I hear people then. Unfortunately, Islam is becoming more and more attractive to these disenfranchised Western men because they can't find. Everybody wants the trad Catholic virgin wife. Well, it's hard to find that traditional Christian girl to start your family with. And so this has caused a sort of malaise amongst young Western men. And so due to somebody like Andrew Tate, who was an internet phenomenon, then later converting from Orthodoxy to Islam, there is a significant tide of these young Western men. They're like, oh, well, I'll just become Muslim because at least I could probably marry a traditional girl, a virgin girl, and I can have some type of traditional societal structure. But I find it so interesting that the globalist powers that be are both trying to collapse Western culture, or at least Europe, with Islam, and at the same time, it's becoming, for a lot of men, what's perceived as their way out. Is it that the West is specifically targeting these traditional Christians? Meanwhile, they're offering a sort of another religious, traditional framework, I guess, per se. I don't know if I'm making myself very clear, but how would you understand, or how do you perceive this phenomenon? Because I've been talking with some of these young guys, and I'm trying to tell them, becoming Muslim is not what you're really looking for. This is just because they already have a pre-package of what you think you need.
Sure, yeah, and obviously, if somebody were coming to Orthodoxy just for the trad values and getting a trad wife, and was not looking for truth, salvation, for a
Right.
true relationship with God, is sort of missing the whole point.
Right.
And obviously, you don't find that in Islam. You've heard of the phrase controlled opposition, and it's
Yep.
not always controlled, but it's, as you might say, useful opposition in a way. You know, remember back in the, how long ago, it was Occupy Wall Street. This leftist movement was almost like a precursor for Antifa. Well, are they really the opponents of corporate power, or are they foot soldiers of corporate power? In other words,
Right.
when I look at the growth of Islam in the West and people who are attracted to it, what do they have in common with the LGBT and the other nihilists who are the ruling regime? Well, they hate the traditional Christian, European, English speaking identity of this country. In other words,
Right.
that you notice that whenever some Muslims stand up against LGBT, they're not going to attack a Muslim baker for not
Right.
baking a rainbow cake or something for a same-sex marriage, because they realize instinctively they're kind of on our side. They're also attacking the traditional society they were trying to destroy. Also, there's a little bit of scare factor involved. You don't attack the Muslims because they'll get violent, and
Right.
which is actually part of their creed.
Yep.
So I think there's a sense that, yeah, if they go Muslim, they can be useful to us. They're helping to break down the identity we want, and let's not mess with them anyway because it's too much trouble. It also fits into the Sam Francis concept of anarcho tyranny, that you don't come down on people who are violent or troublesome, because that's dangerous. You go after the people are peaceful and law abiding.
Right.
And so Christians are a soft target.
Right.
Muslims aren't such a soft target, so they tend to leave them alone, and they're useful as far as that goes. Same reason, by the way, that the Western powers just love Al Qaeda, ISIS, and these other jihadist groups. They're basically foot soldiers for the
Yep.
Western powers.
Exactly. And we don't even get into the speculation that we created all those organizations, but one of the recent conversations I had with a gentleman who's actually I won't say which church, but he's certainly Orthodox sympathetic, but he's actually a bishop in another denomination. And he mentioned that in Toronto, they're basically having the conversation: who's more oppressed, the Muslim man that can hardly speak, English or French, or the black lesbian woman,
Yeah.
or the white trans woman who's actually a gay man who's had breast implants, and so like who's the one that's most oppressed? And that totally sums up exactly what you're saying, is that these are all just different vehicles for the same arm of the military.
They've all got
Go ahead.
Yeah, they've all got a spoke on the intersectionality wheel, and they
Yes,
all have victim
exactly.
points of various sorts. And you and I don't. I think Orthodoxy is not so alien or minority. We get victim points. One footnote: what you said about creating these radical groups. I don't know if you recall, during the 2016 campaign, Trump accused Obama and Hillary of being the founder and co-founders of ISIS,
Yeah.
and everybody, oh, that's crazy. And I remember contacting his campaign because I knew people there, saying, you've got him dead to rights. You've got a memo from the Defense Intelligence Agency in 2012, declassified in 2015, that says exactly that. It was the goal of American policy to create a radical principality in eastern Syria. And that's what they did. You've got him dead to rights. And
Right.
they said, well, write up something for us. So I did. I sent it to the campaign. They totally ignore it. And instead, they came back and said, well, what he really meant was we pulled out of Iraq too soon and
Oh
created a
my
vacuum.
gosh.
That's what he really meant. And and in fact, we did create ISIS.
Right.
And just like we've been basically we supported Al Qaeda in Bosnia, we supported them in Kosovo, we supported them in Syria, we supported them in Chechnya, all sorts of places.
Right. And you look at Libya, I mean, they take out Gaddafi and now we have an open slave trade, and they're over here talking about reparations and all these intersectional value. I mean, it makes no sense whatsoever.
Yeah. And it's like when you saw those Republicans going on a big screaming bloody murder about Hillary and the American ambassador being killed in Benghazi. What they would never talk about, what was going on in Benghazi. That was not a consulate. It was a CIA station that was taking weapons from Gaddafi's stocks through our jihadist allies to take them to Syria to go engage in jihad there. And the trouble with these people, they're dangerous. They sometimes your attack dog slips the leash and bad stuff happens. And that's what happened in Benghazi. But certainly none of those Republicans were going to bring that to light, because after all, we only do good stuff when we overthrow governments, right?
Right. If you just have a couple more minutes, there's a question I did want to ask that I forgot to mention, and that is the sort of, again, military situation with Russia and the potential escalation. I mean, the way that I'm viewing this Ukraine thing is the Western world, NATO, really the U.S., Washington, through its allies and the central banks. But I've heard some rhetoric talking about how weak Russia is as a Navy power and how strong this is one of the ways in which the U.S. still has a real sense of dominance in regards to global Navy powers. Where, Russia still has their nuclear power. What is the strength of the Russian military? Where are they a real threat, or how do we understand that? Because there's a lot of rhetoric in the West about how they're outdated, they still got old Soviet stuff. I mean, how would somebody understand the sort of relationship and the technology between the two countries?
Well, Putin has said regarding the war in Ukraine that we haven't even begun to fight this war, that they're only using like 10-20% of their military for the war in Ukraine, that they're holding in the rest in reserve because they don't know if a war will break out with NATO. And I actually wrote a piece about this a few weeks ago. Is Russian restraint uh, reducing the threat of a global war, or encouraging it? Because
Mm,
they clearly don't want to do something in Ukraine that would cause a panic reaction in NATO, to have us do something really stupid like commit forces directly, or like maybe make a lightning rush for Lvov or
mm,
Odessa or someplace in Western Ukraine, and think that we can bluff the Russians into not attacking it. At the
right,
same time, the longer they draw this thing out, they can commit more attrition of the Ukrainian army, and also of all the NATO stocks of weapons that are being conveniently shipped over there so they can destroy them. But that also gives more time for the escalation ladder to go up to someplace extremely dangerous. And
right.
so I think that's part of the calculation they're making in the Kremlin, which of course I'm not party to those discussions. In either case, though, when you listen to people like Colonel Douglas Macgregor or Scott Ritter and others, Brian Bertelick at the New Atlas report, if it did come to an open clash between NATO and Russia, NATO would not do it very well at all. In fact, it would do very badly. That we simply do not have the equipment there. Remember the whole strategy during the Cold War time was that if the Soviet Union attacked NATO, that they could hold them off for a number of days while we had this big transatlantic resupply effort to bring in a whole big army to go defeat them. We don't have that supply network. We don't have the ships to send them, and we wouldn't have the time. And
Right.
so the idea, and plus we don't have the production capacity. We're simply not manufacturing weapons on that scale. So the short answer is, you mentioned the Navy. Yes, I think we still outclass them in the Navy, but we're not fighting a naval war here.
Right.
If we do fight a naval war, it'll probably be against China, and that won't go very well either because of the hypersonic weapons. So that and of course the same people as are behaving very, very provocatively toward the Russians are also doing it toward the Chinese, also doing it toward the Iranians, and let's throw the North Koreans in for good measure.
Right.
It's at some point you reach the end of your vocabulary. You call people stupid, and you say no, stupid doesn't begin to describe it. It's more than that, and I didn't. Maybe it's a form of insanity. I don't know.
It sure seems like it's a form of insanity due to, again, the beliefs and values that they hold. I mean, it's hard to even, again, you look at the U.S. military and everything is about LGBTQ at this point. They mandated,
Yeah,
experimental
yeah,
medical procedures on our military. I mean, it seems like
yeah,
a deliberate self-sabotage by people who are using Ukraine as a money laundering operation. It seems like the same people are getting richer and richer by taking taxpayer money from all these different Western nations, sending, again, the
yeah,
weapons.
yeah,
And that's where it's like, are they preparing for a full collapse? Are they preparing for a nuclear war? It's hard to, as a civilian just watching all this stuff. No, like it seems like you look at the toxic chemical spills. We've had three train derailments in like 4 days. It's like it seems like the
yeah.
our country's under attack by the people who run it.
Yeah, yeah, and I'd like to think they're not so crazy that they would deliberately start a nuclear war, because then we could all die, which I suppose has its silver lining because they won't have to worry about this stuff, right? But I mean, I hope they're not that crazy to take what they call the Samson option, where they bring the temple down upon themselves, because they can't win. but I can't see them giving up either. To me, the best way out of this would be if the Russians don't draw this out much longer, but simply wrap it up. That means probably the end of a Ukrainian state. I mean, obviously there'll still be Ukrainians, there'll still be a Ukrainian country or place called Ukraine, but there won't necessarily be a state.
Right.
And there's simply no there. There's no place for NATO to send these weapons to. There's no Ukrainian army to send them to. There's no Zelensky regime who's commanding an army somewhere. Let him go to his one of his houses somewhere, and that somehow that presents the West with a fait accompli, and then whatever political and other damage, economic damage it causes in the West, it happens. And maybe at some point, maybe in Europe first. I think what happened in Europe first, you start to get some sane governments. I mean, maybe at some point somebody in Germany says, you know what, how can we be the industrial powerhouse of Europe if we don't get cheap Russian energy? This is
Right.
crazy. Why should our best ally destroys our pipeline and destroys our economy? That's our ally. If I were in Germany, I would certainly be saying that.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree. Jim, thanks so much again for coming on and chatting. I'll have your Twitter. What other, are there any handles? How could people reach out to you if they'd like to get in touch with you or ask you any questions, or if that's possible? Is there any way for people to reach out to you?
Yeah, Twitter's the best way. They
Twitter.
can send me a message on Twitter, DM me, or just
Okay.
at Jim Jatras. Well, that's how we connected in the first place. You
Yeah,
know where to find me.
I'll have your link in the video description of this video. So thank you again, Jim. God bless you and your family.
Okay.
Truly appreciate everything you do, and I hope that we can talk soon.
Thank you, David. It's been a privilege.